time. So I'm Dan Isenberg. I want to have a discussion with you about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship ecosystems. As Yanis and Sofia both said, this is an important topic, I gather, because you're here for all of you as well. It's something that I've been devoting the last period of my life to. I'll introduce myself briefly, but I'd like to act. Can you hear me?
I think it's not the best.
Is this better? Okay. I'm going to try and adjust it because I like to move when I talk. And if at any time you can't hear me or if I get out of range of the cameraman, just please just tell me. And I would like to start off by just understanding a little bit about who you are as people. How many of you are entrepreneurs or consider yourself entrepreneurs, for example? How many of you, so about half to two-thirds, and how many of you consider yourselves in support organizations that support entrepreneurship? A few. Anybody who's primarily would say, I'm an investor or a provider of capital? One, maybe two or three other people. It's also important for them to know who you are. So now that you've identified yourself, you may get more inquiries after than I do. Is there anybody who represents here the public sector?
The city of Athens.
The city of Athens, okay. And then anybody here represent, let's say, the university or education? You can raise your hand more than once, obviously, but anyway, professor, researcher, okay, 3 or 4. And then I guess last, would anybody here identify themselves as being affiliated with or part of a large, or a relatively large corporation or established corporation of any kind? So at least we have 1 or 2 people representing all different parts of what I call, or almost all different parts of the ecosystem. And that's important for me to know because, as you know, entrepreneurship is an extraordinarily broad topic. And this concept of ecosystem is it's a relatively new concept as it's applied to entrepreneurship. I think it's a very important one. I think one of the things I want to do with you is have a conversation so that we understand that better. After introducing myself, and feel free to at any time interrupt. I'll tell you if I'll answer your question later, but I think this is a chance to have a conversation amongst ourselves. I do have a lot of slides, but I don't get paid more if I get through the slides. I get paid exactly the same amount. Actually, I get paid twice as much if I get through half the slides. The conversation, if I do get through my slides, has 2 parts to it. One part, the shorter part, is a brief discussion with you of what entrepreneurship is, because we use the word, but it's very rare for people to discuss what that means. So we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about what entrepreneurship is. And then I will present my own viewpoint, and the second part of the discussion will be, how do we foster it in a rapid and systematic way, regardless of the environment or how bad the macroeconomy is? What are the opportunities to stimulate a region so there actually is more entrepreneurship, as I think that a lot of you are doing already? I just read over the last 24 hours of some of the interesting ventures and the interesting investments that have been done in ventures in Athens primarily, or with Greeks who maybe are in the diaspora but have some operation here in Greece as part of their venture. So, with no further ado, I'll try. Okay, I'll try to introduce myself briefly. The older I get, the longer. It's kind of a double-edged sword. The older I get, the longer I have things to introduce, but the more I forget. So it ends up being about the same length. So I've been a professor myself. I've represented many of the identities that you gave yourselves when I asked who you are. I've been a venture capitalist, general partner of one of 4 general partners of $75 million IT, primarily IT software components fund that invested in Series A, for those of you who understand very early stage risky ventures. I was an entrepreneur, built and ran a company for 15 years in Israel, and it became a global company. I've been, since that time, a very active angel investor, and I still have a very active angel, private investor portfolio. I don't know why they call, actually I do know why they call them angels. It's a really undeserved term, but it's stuck. It comes from the film industry about 100 years ago. I'm actually an author, and I wrote the book Worthless, Impossible, and Stupid. And more personally, I've been in the field of entrepreneurship for 3 years. I'm not looking over there just because I'm tethered, invisibly tethered to the microphone. But I've been through a lot personally. These are not everything I've been through, but it does not include any police record. But I've been through, experienced myself 2 economic collapses. I've been involved in them as an actor and as a sufferer. So those of you who are experiencing, all of you, I guess, all of us are experiencing the most recent economic collapse. There was a mini, more sectoral collapse in the year 2001. I can see from the gray hair out in the audience that some of you have experienced that as well. It's very different, but still very painful in a lot of ways. Several currency devaluations, which you're not experiencing. I guess it depends on what happens in Greece, whether you will or won't. I've been through a few wars myself, and as I say, 2 passports, and I've had, as an entrepreneur, 1 success and 1 failure. I have some things to say about the current view that failure is a good thing. Having failed, I think it's a terrible thing. I was more successful than I failed, thank God. And it's one of the things that entrepreneurs should try to avoid doing if they can. So you'll hear me voice quite a few opinions, and they're not just opinions, they're assessments today that'll be a little bit controversial, a little bit out of your, or all of our comfort zones. One of my jobs as an educator is to keep people out of their comfort zones, including myself. And I think that, as you use the word Socrates, transformation, it's virtually impossible to have any kind of social transformation and feel comfortable. Anxiety is intrinsically bound up in the process of change. Thank you, that's really good. As long as there's no feedback. Is that okay? So as we go along, and because time is limited, these are extraordinarily complicated things that we're dealing with, the phenomenon of entrepreneurship and using it as a wedge for economic growth and development. These are extraordinarily complicated things. We have a few minutes to talk about these things, so by definition, not only am I going to be a little bit controversial just to stimulate thinking, but secondly, I'm going to oversimplify, because it's very difficult to do justice to the complexity of real-life phenomena in a short period of time. So I'm very, very well aware of the fact that some of these ideas are both much more complicated and they're very nuanced. But I'll say them in a non-nuanced way in order to be clear and generate conversation. So that's important for me anyway. So we will be out. Let me start off with the tale of 2 people, one of whom you probably have heard of. I can't solve that problem. Maybe I can. One of whom you may have heard of is Greek origin, Dean Kamen. The other one you probably haven't. And let's start off with Dean Kamen. How many of you have heard the name? That also tells a little bit about how old you might be. But Dean Kamen is extremely successful, has been an extremely successful inventor and commercializer of his inventions. And he made a lot of money. Some of the things that he invented were a portable kidney dialysis machine over here, and he invented some exoskeletal medical devices. He also invented and sold, I should say, and made, as I said, made a lot of money. And then he invented something which is a wheelchair that actually climbs stairs, and it's used in some cases. And about 1999, there was a buzz that started buzzing around Silicon Valley, and he's from the Northeast United States, New Hampshire, and my area. But there's a buzz around Silicon Valley about this new thing that he was developing that it was codenamed Ginger. It was kept very secret, codenamed Ginger. And he put himself $50 million into this Ginger. And it got a lot of buzz. It was going to revolutionize the human transportation or the transportation industry. The internet, according to John Doerr, I don't know if John Doerr was partner at Kleiner Perkins, a very big venture capital fund in the West Coast, said this would be much bigger than the internet. And he ended up raising a lot of money from some very, very interesting people, including Credit Suisse. But he also raised money from Stephen Jobs and, say, John Doerr and Jeff Bezos. Put a lot of money into this together. Of course, what I'm talking about is the Segway. And you've all seen the Segway. I can only imagine that you have city tours in Athens or some parts of Athens where you see groups of people with helmets going along. But about 4 or 5 years later, after he raised this $137 million, a lot of news started coming out about how bad the Segway was as a business. And it was listed as one of the 10 worst inventions of the decade, one of the 50 worst inventions of all time, and so on and so forth. From height to disaster, you can see the headlines. And in 2006, Dean Kamen was fired as CEO. And a number of other things happened. They raised some money from the Qataris, from the Emiratis, and but they couldn't raise all the money that they needed to get going. The company was eventually sold to a fellow named Jimmy Heselden, who was found dead, from a UK businessman, Irish, and he was found dead at the bottom of a cliff in Ireland with his Segway next to him. No one really knows whether he had a heart attack and then fell, or whether he drove his Segway off a cliff, but he died, and his assets were sold off, auctioned off, and eventually bought by a very obscure private equity fund in southeastern United States called Summit Strategic Investments. If you Google them, you'll find absolutely nothing about them, except for that they're repositioning Segway. And that's when it became better known as a tourist, a couple of niches, tourism and security, so you see them in airports as well. So that's Segway, and I guess the first question is, when we think of Dean Kamen, how perfect of an example, or how prototypical of an example of entrepreneurship do you think Dean Kamen was? I see heads nodding, I see heads shaking.
He created a lot of buzz at the start.
He created a lot of buzz, and that means that's more entrepreneurial?
Well, that's the main thing.
You think so? So awareness?
Everybody, especially in Greece, but certainly around the world, is talking about traction. Everybody
you're not talking about the traction of the Segway, but
yes, I'm talking.
He got into the market.
Yes, traction.
Got into the market.
Even this whole thing is
what?
Nothing.
The whole thing is nothing.
Even if the whole thing is nothing.
So what's traction mean?
Yes.
Is that buzz, awareness, users, even if you don't make money? Yes. It was all right. You get a passing grade in the middle somewhere. Any different? Sorry. It was a small of all the things that he did. So this was not any different, completely different opinions about whether this was entrepreneurship. But the fact that he put $50 million of his own money into Segway means that he made $50 million from his other activities. He commercialized other inventions. So is that important?
In a way, he put all his money in that way.
Believe me, he did not put in all of his money. He still has a helicopter. So does the fact that he essentially wiped out burned up $137 million of investment, does that make him a better or worse entrepreneur? More prototypical or less prototypical as an entrepreneur?
Doesn't make anything. I mean, you cannot quantify his success unless if you know what the worth of the product.
But you can quantify his success, but you can quantify his failure, because we know that he burned through. We can guess pretty easily that when Summit Ventures came in, they bought some assets very cheaply. He burned up $137 million. His investors, John Doerr, Jeff Bezos, my colleague at Harvard Business School, they lost all their money. So we can quantify the consumption of value. It's hard to quantify the creation of value. here. Does that matter? To be an entrepreneur? Well, this is what was raised over here as an inventor, but here he obviously invented something that was successful. In the past, not only did he invent things, but he sold them. So he was much, at least in the past, was much more than an inventor. Whether he's an entrepreneur or not, I don't know, but he made a lot of money, like Thomas Edison, who was an incredible inventor, became extraordinarily wealthy from his inventions. And you're right in saying that that's not the same thing. Inventing and making a lot of money are not necessarily go together. A lot of inventors died poor. So I'll give you another example who probably no one has ever heard of. His name is Robert Weston. At the same time, oh, you do know. Oh, how do you know him? Are you in pharmaceuticals? Oh, okay.
He's actually named, because of the Icelandic financial crisis, there's like this multi-billionaire that was involved with something.
Yes, Thor, the other, yeah, okay. So he just wrote a book. He just wrote a book, Thor. Okay, we can go into that later. I know Robert very well. A little bit younger than Dean Kamen at the time, 29 years old. He came back to Iceland after working in Germany for a shipping company and bought into a generics pharmaceutical company, which became called Actavis over time. And I'll just give you some numbers. He didn't start the company. The company was about 30 years old, had 3 drugs. As I say, generics, about 90 employees, 14 million euro in revenue, and was 2 weeks away from bankruptcy. This was before the crisis. This was just bad management. 2 weeks away from closing the doors because of illiquidity. He came in at 29. 8 years later, and there are no typographical errors here in terms of extra zeros or extra numbers. 8 years later, there were 11,000 employees, number 5 in the world in generics. Today it's number 2 or number 3, depending on how you count, in generics. The presence in, I choose 2007 because actually he left in 2008. He left Actavis, but, and I wrote the case. I published a case on this, and it's also in my book. With over 11,000 employees, 26, actually 32, every acquisition was a successful acquisition, $1.6 billion of sales, and about the same equity value, etc. So, and by the way, he went in 2008, he founded a new company, and it's now called Alvogen. Alvogen, his second company, he didn't found either. He created out of existing assets, and it's in its 5th year of existence. We're writing a case as well. 2014, they closed the books with $500 million in revenues, 5 years from his start. So, I guess I should say this, that before you get fantasies about what Robert Westman did, there was nothing innovative in what he did. The generic pharmaceuticals is, by definition, a non-innovative activity in terms of product. And the playbook for being successful in generic pharmaceuticals was, and still is to a large extent, known to all the players. Everybody knows exactly what the key success factors are. You succeed by execution. So it's a pure execution play. If you can get to the market faster than your competitors, you'll get 50% market share and they'll get 5% market share. If it's a matter of a week or 2 weeks difference in this industry. So there's nothing innovative here about either the process or certainly not the product. And so now I'll ask you to compare which is the better. This is a slightly, in some ways easier, and slightly in some ways more difficult task. Which was the more prototypical example of an entrepreneur? Is one more than the other? And before you say both, because I have this conversation a lot with people, before you say both, I'm going to exclude that as a possibility, because they are diametrically opposed. Every single thing they did was different. Dean Kamen was innovative, put in his personal wealth, was risk-taking, it was a startup, he accepted failure, he lost money, he didn't achieve his vision, and he was a bad executor. Robert Weston was precisely the opposite. He was a copycat, he had no personal wealth that he invested in the company. If there's one thing that he doesn't like to do, it's fail. He hates, I know, I'm telling you this as a fact. If there's one person who hates failure, it's Robert Weston. He didn't start up the company. He used existing assets. He made a lot of money. He lost $250 million overnight, and I'm sure in the crash October 6th in Iceland, 2008, but still had some assets left over, not much. Achieved market success, created value for shareholders, etc. So Dean Kamen and Robert Westman, with some very minor exceptions, they're both men. They both started in 1999, but they are completely opposite from each other. What vision of entrepreneurship could we have that includes them both? So if you can't, then which one, who is the more prototypical entrepreneur? The non-innovative, execution-based, non-startup, or the startup, innovation, no execution, who raised a lot of money and created a lot of buzz, a tremendous amount of buzz.
The prototypical is the Dean Kamen from what we see around. Which one is more like a turnover wizard, someone that goes to a company and creates value through financial decisions, etc.
Well, this wasn't financial. This was through execution, marketing, operations, management, manufacturing.
It's like needing to be the CEO of doing things.
So you're saying this is entrepreneurial. Yes. Even if you completely destroy value, you don't succeed in the market, you can't translate the buzz into money, and then that's what entrepreneurs are. You're saying that's what entrepreneurs do.
This is what is the common idea for risk-taking.
Not your idea, just the common idea.
Okay.
What's your idea?
From a financial decision, I believe that everything must, the numbers must support in the end.
You actually made two different questions. The one that you were asking before, there was the personification of an entrepreneur.
See, there's always one in every class. There's a very smart guy who says, you actually asked two different questions. Two different questions. The first and the second were different.
Exactly. So a personification is obviously Robert Westman of an entrepreneur per se. Whereas Dean Kamen, product development-wise or innovation-wise, our risk-taker, who is a better risk-taker, again, we're not sure a better risk-taker is Dean Kamen.
But maybe the conclusion is that innovation is not intrinsic to the process of entrepreneurship.
Exactly.
Maybe the conclusion is that risk-taking is not intrinsic to the process of entrepreneurship. It is, and the only thing I'll say, I'll let you finish, but the only thing I'll say, yes, it's a matter of definition, but that's important. Definitions are important because they guide what we do as a collectivity. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Exactly. That's how you find innovation. That's how you find innovation. It's about an enterprise and clearly if entrepreneurship is about innovation, then you have to go to the
right. And so I will argue.
Two examples, two instances. And the question is, if I try the lifting 10 times or 1,000 times and the right thing 1,000 times, which one will come up then? Two instances don't really
the answer is, I don't know if these are generic recipes, if these are recipes that can be taken. But Robert Weston's done it now twice out of 2 times. So.
Then I can think people that have done 50 times on the left side.
Yes, and there are many people, including myself, who have done it on the left side. Let's continue. Let me go on and give you my own, because I think they're dramatic. I think there are dramatic implications of this example. And it goes back to the comments that were made at the opening about scale-up, about how the dialogue around growth has to be an intrinsic part of the dialogue of entrepreneurship. The dialogue of scale, of growth, of value creation has to be part of the discussion of entrepreneurship. And but some of these implications directly address that issue. And one is that entrepreneurship. These are my opinions, and I agree that it's a question of definition. I think that I can justify my opinions, or at least most of them, in terms of their being useful. There's one of the ways of judging whether a definition is good, one of the ways is good or not, is whether it's useful, whether it allows you to do something that a different definition doesn't allow you to do. And I think the definition of entrepreneurship that I will provide to you allows you to do things that another definition that's more innovation and startup related doesn't allow you to do. It doesn't preclude innovation, but it doesn't rely on innovation. And I realize saying that at Innovathens is somewhere between risky and foolish, because I may be not allowed to leave the country or made to leave the country much sooner. I'm not sure which. But innovation's a tool sometimes, not always. So it's intrinsically growth driven. Secondly, it's about growing up and not starting up. In fact, and I'll say more about this later, possibly, you can actually show fairly, both empirically and logically, that the more new companies you have in any economy, the fewer growing companies you have in that same economy. That's an empirical fact. California, just as an example, is very, very low in the number of new company registrations. Interesting. So is Massachusetts, very low in new company formation on a pro rata basis. By the way, Greece is fairly high, for what that's worth. So it's real, and you can also logically, not only empirically, but logically, the activity in an economy of starting up registering new ventures or starting up new companies, and the activity of growing them, they have the characteristics of a zero-sum game. The more of one you have, the less of the other. And the main reason for that is they both use up the most important resource for growing a company. That's people. They both consume people. So a scaling up company removes startup potential from the labor market. Starting up company removes human potential, human capital from the growing company markets. Now, one second. What I said is, in general, it's a logical argument. In a completely frictionless, I'm allowing myself to be a little bit academic here, in a completely frictionless economy, they wouldn't be. Only problem is there is no such thing as a completely frictionless economy.
If you have an inclusive model, an inclusive business model.
The question is, if you have an inclusive business model, these are words, I'm going to ask the gentleman what those words mean. That's not true. What do you mean by inclusive business model?
You include all the stakeholders in your project, in your business model. People, buyers, consumers, everyone.
Let me sharpen it and see if it's not just a question of semantics. That if we decide, if we're an economy together, we're 110, 120 people, whatever, if we decide that we are an economy and we begin to grow companies together, and it's a fixed economy. If we do that, then if I'm successful, and I don't just create buzz, but I also actually create growth, and I'm selling lots of segues, and I'm having lots of tours, and so on, I'm going to want to hire half the people in this room. And if I don't hire them, I won't be able to grow. Those half people will not be starting up companies, because they'll be working for me. That's what I mean. Now, do you still think that's not an inclusive model for some reason?
It is, but we have limited resources, but then that's not really nice.
The one resource, if you talk to entrepreneurs around the world, and I've done this in well over 40 countries around the world, you talk to people who are growing companies, by far, the scarcest and most valuable resource that limits or enhances their growth is the ability to hire people. Everywhere in the world, whether it's Boston or Tanzania or Israel or anywhere, the biggest obstacle to companies grow is people. And some of you are growing companies, you need to hire 10 IT people who know iOS 8, and you say, oh my God, I can't find those 8 people. You know, one of the reasons, and I'm exaggerating, one of the reasons you can't find those 8 people, this is absolutely true in Israel, is because they're starting companies. That's one of the reasons. So, as I say, these are complex things. I'm trying to get us all to think. Number 3 is typically entrepreneurship is an incremental process. It's not a disruptive process. Even if you look at the famous so-called disruptive technologies, a few are really disruptive. And by the way, I don't treat disruptive as a negative thing. It's not a positive thing. By definition, intrinsically, the definition of disruption is negative. But it's typically incremental. If you look at even such as the iPad and the iPod and iTunes and so on, all of these were business models that were tried, and there were incremental changes, something that I've called innovation, small tweaks. Was that, sorry? Like many powerful things in entrepreneurship, operating experience helps. And I was trying to imagine the audience that would be here today, because it's affiliated somehow. It got in my mind that this was something related to the university, and I was imagining people who would be about 15 years younger than the people in this group. And I'm really happy to see the people here apparently have a lot of life experience and possibly a lot of business experience as well, and that's helpful. The glorification of youth as being beneficial to entrepreneurship primarily is the result of 2008 and the lack of employment opportunities. And we justified that after the fact, post hoc, we justified that as being young people being better entrepreneurs, but that's post hoc justification of them not having jobs and having to choose between a career when you graduate, and everyone promised you, or your kids, my kids, when they graduated from school, they'd have job opportunities, and here they are graduating in 2009 from the best schools in the world with the best educations, and they have the following career choices. One career choice, do a master's degree. Career choice, do a master's degree. Career choice of going to work for an established company doesn't exist. So second, I can go live with my mother on her couch and reclaim my old room as a kid. Number 3, I can be unemployed. And number 4, I can be a startup. So given those 4 career options, choosing a startup, usually in combination with living on my mother's couch, is oftentimes chosen. Let me go a little bit faster, and then we'll keep going back and forth with conversation. But my statement about entrepreneurship is that it's always about economic value creation. I think, by the way, that over time that's inclusive. But it's over time. Because you can show very clearly, I've done an economic analysis of Silicon Valley and all the exits of Twitter and Facebook and Google. And if there's one thing that's clear that they created massive inequality almost overnight. This incredible entrepreneurial success of Facebook and the 3,000 millionaires overnight, many of them, a few of them billionaires, created in their environment extraordinarily powerful economic dynamics, including massive inequality. And if you could somehow do a Gini coefficient for Silicon Valley, which you can't, you would see it skyrocketing to be one of the most extraordinarily unequal environments in the world. Nevertheless, it's always about economic, I would claim, value creation. And when more companies grow faster in a given region, the economies have no choice but to grow. I'm not saying that's the only driver of economic growth, but you will not have, I've not yet seen a region with sustained economic growth that doesn't have indigenous companies more and more growing more and more rapidly. Yes?